Hey guys, thanks for tuning in. In the next 10 to 12 minutes, you're just going to see a review of a few things regarding the Sony A7 Mark III. I'm sure if you're tuning in, you probably already know the specs of this camera, and you've probably seen some reviews already. So this is not a review in the traditional sense. I've taken some B-roll, which is a mixture of 4K footage at 24p and also 1080 footage at 120 frames per second. And I wanted to see what the difference was when you put them on a 4K timeline. On top of that, I did it all in manual focus to see what the screen was like and how useful it was, and also you'll just hear me talk about a few more factors regarding convenience. Alright, here's an intro. So I've had this camera for a couple of weeks now. It's the Sony A7 Mark III, which, if you haven't heard of it, it's the camera that's been doing the rounds recently, and a lot of people have been switching from using Canon cameras to Sony, basically because in this relatively small light box that costs a lot less than the equivalent Canon, you're getting some incredible features, some really high quality stuff, and it's been hard for people not to move over, really, when you consider that Canon are sort of cheapskating people with their cameras. That's my opinion anyway. So I wanted to go out and see what this was really made of. I've done a couple of shoots with it, which I've been happy with. There are shortcomings, that's the same with any camera, and you can't get everything in one box, I would say. But I wanted to see what the really important thing was when it came to 4K versus 1080. Now, if you want to do 120 frames a second slow-mo, or even 60, you have to use 1080 on this camera. You can't do it in 4K. And I wanted to see what effect that had on the footage. So I've made some B-roll. I had a chance to chill out in London. I was in Holborn, also called Midtown now. It's been rebranded so that hopefully it's got more appeal, I guess, to businesses and other people. Able to take a good array of different footage, and you'll be able to see which ones I've slowed down, but I'll label it for you anyway. And I want you to be able to see for yourself what you think, whether it really can work. And if you are going to put 1080 footage in the 4K, maybe there's some things to think about first. Make sure it's really necessary, that it's the right type of footage, and that if you're going to film it in 1080, 120 frames per second, that you are actually going to slow it down, because otherwise you could have shot it in 4K. So here's the footage. I'm going to label what was shot 4K 24 frames per second and what was shot 1080 120 frames per second. And hopefully you can see the same difference that I can, which is that personally, I'm not so sure about this 1080 footage. Alright, that was the B-roll. I hope you enjoyed that. It was great fun being out there with the Sony. In my experience of cameras which are all Canon, I've got to say the Sony is great fun to shoot with. There's just something about holding that camera that makes it feel great. So I was out filming for maybe 3 hours, took about an hour of footage, and this was really a test of whether the Sony's screen was able to help me out when it came to manually focusing. And you know, this was all run and gun, this was all spur of the moment, and I wanted to catch some cool things. And obviously you're going to miss out on stuff sometimes if you're manually focusing, but the question is, do I want a big 5-inch or bigger screen on top of here to help me out with that in those situations? And you'll see in the footage that not everything focused perfectly, and I had to discard some stuff, which is annoying, but it means two things. A, I need to up my game when it comes to manually focusing, and B, I probably could do with investing in an external screen. And then also you can record in a slightly better codec, I believe, if you do that. And the lens I was using that day was actually this one, which is the Sigma Art lens. It's the 50mm 1.4. I had some ND filters on the front. When it came to manual focusing, actually I really enjoyed using the focus magnifier, which I did manage to use quite a lot. I haven't started using focus peaking, and that's more because I need to learn exactly what that means, and it's not something I've used before, because when I was using Canon I actually was just using autofocus all the time. Now I've got some really good lenses and I'm getting more into the idea of manual focusing and how that can add to your creativity and the way that you see the shot. I'm just learning all about it, but from what I hear the focus peaking is quite good on this camera. And my thoughts on what I've got out of this camera and what I've really enjoyed. It's light and it packs a punch in that. I find the memory dial here, the 1 and the 2, which I set, one of them I set to 4K 24p with a 1/50th shutter speed, and the other one I set for the slow-mo, so 120 with a 250 1/250th shutter speed, and that's at 1080p obviously. And then that means that I can just flip between the two. And one thing I would say is it was surprisingly slow to switch between the two, and I don't know whether it was sort of buffering onto the SD card after the last thing I'd shot, and therefore when I would flick the dial there'd be a good few seconds of difference, and occasionally I really wanted to take some slow-mo stuff of things going by and I couldn't get there quickly enough. So that's definitely one downside, but I don't think I could have done it any more quickly if I was manually changing all of the settings without using the memory, so it is what it is. The second thing I noticed is that the screen is not good enough in the sense of the way it articulates. You know, I like to get the camera down low, I like to get it above a crowd, let's say, using a monopod and whatnot, and just for all that sort of flexibility, run and gun, especially when you've just got it on a shoulder strap and you're trying to move around and get a cool angle. The screen is really annoying. I find it's quite small, especially if you're manually focusing, it's quite difficult. And just the fact that it just doesn't articulate enough, you know, it doesn't flip out and give you all of the movement that you need. So that's something that I would hope they could change, but it seems to be a gripe amongst everyone, and no one, except for Canon really, no one seems to be putting it on many of their cameras. Plus sides that I found, you know, in practicality terms, the battery was great. I was filming, you know, turning it off and on constantly over a 3-hour period of time, and it used about 70% of the battery. So if I was at a commercial shoot over a day of, you know, spending time setting up the shots and all the things that come in between the shots, I think actually it would work pretty well for most of the day, if not all of it, especially if you have a lunch break and you charge it in between. The other thing to note is I think the in-body stabilization is actually pretty good. I'm not the most steady-handed guy when it comes to filming, so for me that's actually really helped out. There's no sort of, none of the sort of shake as such. It's, you know, you do see if you move wrongly or badly, you will see it, of course, and I guess if you're on a gimbal you might want to turn it off anyway. So in conclusion, what do I think? Well, I really do enjoy using this camera. It's much better than the Canon 70D that I was using for the purposes of creating a sort of cinematic B-roll footage. It's missing some features. Every camera is a compromise essentially, and if it had a proper flip screen, you know, I would happily pay for that. And And also if it could shoot 4K at 60 frames per second, I would happily pay for that too. But I guess that's what's going to come in the higher end cameras, probably not the tilt screen. I think they've missed the boat on that one. Doesn't seem like they're going to introduce it. If you've made it this far in the video, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed what you saw, please give it a thumbs up. And if you like this sort of content, then maybe you should subscribe. And if you didn't like what you saw, or if you have some comments regarding my footage or any way that I can improve, which I'm sure there are many, many of those, then please give it a thumbs down or just comment and tell me what I should do better. Alright, have a good day. Cheers.